The Ties That Bind. Chapter 1. Silas Varon turned 18 at midnight, and the moment the clock struck, the bond snapped into place. It wasn't supposed to be Callum Drexler. Not his best friend. Not the boy he'd grown up wrestling in the dirt and sneaking out of training with. Silas stood frozen in the middle of the Blackridge Pack's coming-of-age celebration, staring at Callum, whose stunned expression mirrored his own. The pull between them was undeniable, an invisible thread tightening, sealing them together in a way that no force could break. Callum's heart pounded, a mixture of joy and fear battling within him. He had spent years dreaming of the moment he would find his mate, never once expecting it to be Silas. And yet, here it was, the universe declaring them fated. But before he could say anything, Silas took a step back, his jaw clenching. "No," he muttered under his breath, then louder, This isn't right. I can't accept this." The words hit like a punch to the gut, and Callum's throat tightened, his excitement shattering into 1,000 pieces. The crowd around them had begun to take notice, whispers spreading like wildfire. The Blackridge Pack had never seen an alpha reject their fated mate before. It was unheard of. Callum forced a laugh, ignoring the sting in his chest. "That's rich coming from you, Varon. You rejecting me? Maybe I should be the one rejecting you." His smirk was sharp, but his hands trembled at his sides. Silas flinched, his expression unreadable, but he didn't take back his words. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Callum standing alone, feeling more lost than ever. As the celebration continued without him, Callum slipped away into the night, his mind racing. Maybe fate had made a mistake. Maybe Silas would come to his senses. Or maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something much more painful than he was ready for. Chapter 2. The Aftermath. Callum barely slept that night, his mind replaying Silas's rejection like a broken record. By morning, the pack had already begun whispering about the alpha heir who refused his mate, and Callum felt every glance like a dagger to his pride. He stormed into the training grounds, throwing himself into combat drills, hoping the physical exhaustion would drown out the ache in his chest. It didn't. Silas was already there, sparring with some warriors, but the moment their eyes met, an electric tension crackled between them. Silas faltered for just a second, just long enough for his opponent to land a solid hit. Callum smirked despite himself, crossing his arms. "Getting sloppy, Varon," he taunted, keeping his voice light. "Must be hard, rejecting the best thing that ever happened to you." The words were playful, but the underlying bitterness made Silas's jaw tighten. Silas wiped the blood from his lip, his expression unreadable. "You don't understand, Callum," he muttered, voice strained. It can't happen. I have responsibilities." Callum scoffed, stepping closer until they were almost chest to chest. "And what about me? Do I not have a say in this, or am I just supposed to accept that my mate would rather push me away than face reality?" The air between them grew thick, heated, but before Silas could respond, their beta instructor barked at them to get back to training, breaking the moment before it could spiral further. Callum threw himself into the fight, but his mind was no longer on the drills. If Silas wasn't going to fight for them, then maybe it was time for Callum to stop waiting. Chapter 3. A New Offer. The following week, Callum's father, Beta Darius, summoned him to a private meeting. Callum entered the study, confused, only to find Alpha Cedric of the Stormhold Pack sitting across from his father, his presence commanding and authoritative. "Callum," Beta Darius said, gesturing for him to sit, "Alpha Cedric has extended an invitation for you to join Stormhold's diplomatic exchange. It's a chance to train, learn, and strengthen ties between our packs." Callum frowned. He had never considered leaving Blackridge, but the opportunity was tempting, a fresh start away from Silas, away from the suffocating weight of rejection. "And why me?" he asked, eyeing Alpha Cedric warily. The older wolf smiled. "Because I see potential in you. And because my son, Magnus, could use a strong partner at his side." The word sent a shiver down Callum's spine, though he wasn't sure if it was intrigue or apprehension. Later that evening, Callum sat by the training fields, mulling over the offer when Silas found him. His best friend, his mate, stood there, tension radiating off him. "You're leaving?" Silas asked, voice tight. Callum tilted his head, feigning indifference. "Why do you care? You made it clear you don't want me." Silas flinched, something raw flickering in his gaze, but he quickly masked it. "Blackridge is your home." Callum rose to his feet, stepping into Silas's space, letting the bond pull at them, teasing, taunting. "Maybe I need a new home," he whispered before walking away, leaving Silas standing in the moonlight, fists clenched, jaw tight. Chapter 4. A New Beginning. Callum didn't look back as he crossed into Stormhold Pack's territory, even though his heart felt heavier with every step. The towering pines, crisp mountain air, and distant howls of wolves felt foreign compared to Blackridge, but he welcomed the change. Maybe distance was exactly what he needed. He wasn't here to mourn what could have been with Silas, he was here to move on. At the entrance to the main hall, Magnus Rohn stood waiting, arms crossed over his broad chest, a slow smirk tugging at his lips. "Callum Peterson," he drawled, his deep voice laced with amusement. "I was expecting someone taller." Callum rolled his eyes. "And I was expecting an alpha who didn't have the ego of a mountain." Magnus chuckled, unfazed. "You'll find I exceed expectations in many ways." His teasing tone sent a flicker of warmth through Callum's chest, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the weeks ahead. Dinner with the Stormhold warriors was loud and full of banter, the opposite of the stiff formality in Blackridge. Callum found himself laughing despite himself, exchanging sharp-witted jabs with Magnus over food. But as the night wore on and the firelight flickered against the wooden walls, Magnus leaned in slightly, his golden eyes sharp. "So, tell me, Callum, are you here to train? Or are you here to run away from someone?" The question sent a jolt through him, but Callum masked it with a smirk. "Can't it be both?" Magnus hummed in amusement but didn't press. Instead, he lifted his glass. "To fresh starts, then." Callum hesitated, but when he finally clinked his cup against Magnus, he felt, for the first time in weeks, that maybe leaving had been the right choice. Chapter 5. Unspoken Tension. The next morning, Callum woke before dawn, determined to throw himself into training. He found Magnus already in the sparring yard, rolling his shoulders like a predator ready to pounce. "I hope you're better with your fists than you are with words," Callum taunted, stepping onto the training mat. Magnus grinned, eyes gleaming. "We'll see." The moment their fight began, Callum wasn't prepared for the raw power behind Magnus' strikes. He dodged, barely keeping up, but when Magnus lunged, Callum twisted under him and swept his legs out from under him. Magnus hit the ground with a thud, and for a split second, their positions reversed. Callum straddled Magnus' hips, his breath coming fast. Silence stretched between them, tension crackling in the air. Magnus' gaze dropped to Callum's lips for just a fraction of a second before Callum quickly rolled off him, heart pounding. He hadn't felt this kind of charged energy in a long time, not since Silas. Magnus sat up, chuckling. "Impressive. Maybe you aren't just a pretty face after all." Callum snorted, tossing a towel at him. But as he walked away, he realized with a start that Magnus had felt it too. Chapter 6. Whispers in the Wind. A letter arrived from Blackridge that evening, bearing Silas's seal. Callum stared at it for a long moment before finally tearing it open. "You left without saying goodbye." That was all it said. Nothing more. No apology, no explanation. Just a simple, frustratingly vague sentence that made Callum's blood boil. Magnus, passing by, raised a brow. "Bad news." Callum exhaled sharply, crumpling the letter in his fist. "Just a reminder of why I'm here." Magnus didn't push, but he sat beside Callum on the steps of the training hall, his quiet presence grounding in a way Callum hadn't expected. And for the first time since leaving, Callum felt like maybe he could breathe again. Chapter 7. A Dance of Fate. A festival was held that night in Stormhold to welcome the neighboring packs, and Callum was surprised when Magnus offered his hand. "Come dance with me," he said, smirking. "Or are you too afraid to be seen with another alpha?" Callum rolled his eyes but took Magnus' hand anyway. The music thrummed around them as they moved in perfect sync, playful but undeniably intimate. Callum had never danced with an alpha before, at least, not like this. Not in a way that made his pulse race. As they twirled through the crowd, Magnus pulled him closer, lips brushing against Callum's ear as he whispered, "Tell me something, Callum. If I kissed you right now, would you let me? Callum's breath hitched. He wasn't sure what stunned him more, Magnus' boldness or the fact that he didn't immediately want to pull away. Chapter 8. The Shadow of the Past. That night, Callum lay in bed staring at the wooden ceiling, his thoughts a tangled mess. He should feel at peace here. Stormhold was giving him something Blackridge never had, freedom. He had no obligations, no history weighing him down, no complicated emotions tying him to an alpha who never wanted him in the first place. And yet, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the way Magnus had looked at him tonight. The teasing edge in his voice, the playful warmth in his touch, it was different from Silas. Magnus made him feel seen, not like something fragile to be handled with caution. But was it real? Or was it just another distraction? He rolled onto his side, burying his face into the pillow, but sleep refused to come. His body still hummed from the heat of Magnus' closeness, the whispered question lingering in his ears. If I kissed you right now, would you let me? He didn't know the answer, and that scared him more than anything. He'd spent so long waiting for Silas, believing no one else could make his heart race like that, but now he wasn't so sure. His thoughts drifted to the festival, the way Magnus' hands had rested at his waist, firm yet patient. How easily they had fallen into rhythm, as if their bodies already knew the steps even when their minds hadn't caught up yet. Would it be so wrong to let himself feel something new? A sudden knock at the door made his breath hitch. At first, he thought it might be Magnus, maybe coming to push for an answer he wasn't ready to give. But as he approached and caught the familiar scent seeping through the cracks, his heart plummeted. The scent of home, of past regrets and long-buried longing. Silas. Callum hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob, his pulse hammering against his ribs. What the hell was he doing here? Had he come to drag him back, to claim him now that someone else had started to take an interest? Or was it something else entirely? Steeling himself, Callum swung the door open, and there he was. Silas stood in the doorway, shoulders tense, his usually sharp eyes dulled with something Callum couldn't quite place. His clothes were slightly disheveled, as if he'd traveled in a hurry, and when their eyes met, a flicker of something raw passed between them. Guilt. Relief. Need. Callum's throat went dry, but he forced himself to stand tall, even as his stomach twisted itself into knots. "You didn't say goodbye," Silas said, his voice rough with exhaustion. It wasn't an accusation, nor was it a plea. It was just a statement of fact, one that carried the weight of everything left unsaid. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The tension in the room was suffocating, pressing down on Callum like a weight he couldn't shake. He crossed his arms over his chest, forcing himself to keep his breathing steady. "You don't get to show up here and act like that matters," he said, his voice carefully neutral. If he let even an ounce of emotion slip through, he knew he would break. Silas stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and for the first time since arriving at Stormhold, Callum felt trapped. The space was too small, too intimate, and Silas's scent was everywhere, wrapping around him like a ghost of the past. "I know," Silas murmured, running a hand through his dark hair, his frustration evident in the way he paced the small room. "I know I messed up, Callum. He let out a slow breath, his jaw clenching before he finally looked Callum in the eye. "I never wanted to hurt you." The words should have meant something, but they didn't. Not now. Not after everything. Callum let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "That's the thing, isn't it? You never wanted to hurt me. You never wanted to push me away. You never wanted to reject our bond. But you did. And I had to pick up the pieces on my own." His voice cracked slightly at the end, but he refused to let it show. Silas took a step forward, eyes darkening. "I didn't reject you, Callum." His words sent a jolt through him, his body instinctively reacting before his mind could process them. He scoffed, taking a step back. "You might as well have." His voice was bitter, filled with all the pain he'd been trying to bury. "You knew what I felt for you, Silas. You knew what we were supposed to be, and you still treated me like I was something temporary. Like I was something you could put on a shelf until you were ready." His throat felt tight, his breath uneven, but he pushed forward anyway. "And I refuse to be that anymore." Silas's expression flickered, Anger, regret, desperation all warring in his gaze. "It wasn't about you." His voice rose slightly, filled with frustration. "It was never about you, Callum. It was about me. About the weight of being an alpha, about the fear of failing you. You think I didn't want you?" His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his whole body vibrating with tension. "I wanted you so badly it scared the hell out of me." The confession hit Callum like a punch to the gut, but it wasn't enough. He wanted to believe it, wanted to let the pain melt away and fall into Silas's arms like nothing had ever been broken. But things had broken, and he wasn't sure if they could be put back together. Chapter 10. A Battle of Wills. Silas was too close now, his warmth seeping into Callum's skin, making it impossible to think straight. His scent, something woodsy and familiar, wrapped around him like a vice, awakening every buried instinct Callum had tried to suppress. It would be so easy to give in, to let himself fall back into the comfort of what they were supposed to be. But then he thought of Magnus, of the way he had made Callum laugh, the way he had seen him as more than just an obligation. Callum took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay firm. "If you're here to ask me to come back, I'm not going." Silas flinched, but he recovered quickly, his jaw tightening. "That's not why I'm here." His voice was quieter now, filled with something almost vulnerable. I needed to see you." Callum swallowed hard, his defenses wavering for just a moment. He wanted to ask why. Why now? Why after all this time? But before he could, Silas reached for his wrist, fingers brushing against his skin in a touch so light it sent a shiver down Callum's spine. His breath caught, and for a brief, dangerous second, he saw everything they could have had flash before his eyes. The years of knowing each other better than anyone else. The stolen glances, the fleeting touches, the undeniable pull of their bond. And then, just as quickly, he ripped his hand away. "You don't get to do this," he whispered, voice shaking. "Not anymore." Silas looked like he wanted to argue, to fight for something, but for the first time, Callum saw hesitation. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. And this time, Callum was the one to walk away first. Chapter 11. A Game of Distance. Callum spent the next few days avoiding Silas, keeping himself busy with whatever tasks he could find. He trained with the warriors of Stormhold, sparred with Magnus, and even helped the healers gather herbs from the nearby forest, anything to keep his mind from spiraling back to that night. But no matter how much he tried to push it away, Silas's words haunted him. "I wanted you so badly it scared the hell out of me." If Silas had felt that strongly, why had he kept his distance all those years? Why had he let Callum believe he was nothing more than a passing thought? It was too late to change things now. Magnus noticed his distraction but didn't push. Instead, he challenged him in the sparring ring, his usual smirks replaced with something more serious. "You're not here right now," Magnus muttered after dodging one of Callum's half-hearted attacks. He sidestepped and grabbed Callum's wrist, twisting it behind his back in one swift motion. "And if you're not here, you're vulnerable." Callum gritted his teeth, but before he could break free, Magnus leaned close, voice a quiet murmur against his ear. "You need to decide, Callum. Are you running from him, or are you running from yourself?" The words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. That night, Callum sat by the fire with Magnus and the others, forcing himself to laugh at the playful banter between the warriors. Magnus had a way of drawing people in, his sharp wit and easy confidence making it impossible not to be entertained. But even as Callum smiled, his thoughts kept drifting to the lingering tension between him and Silas. He hated this. Hated feeling trapped in his own emotions. When Magnus nudged him with his elbow, raising an eyebrow, Callum sighed. "I just need time," he admitted, voice quieter than he intended. Magnus studied him for a moment before smirking. "Time won't change how you feel," he said. "Only you can do that." Just as Callum opened his mouth to argue, a familiar scent brushed past him, stopping his heart cold. Silas. He was standing a few feet away, watching the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Callum saw something flicker in his gaze, something dangerously close to jealousy. But before either of them could say anything, Silas turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Callum with a stomach full of knots and a head full of unanswered questions. Chapter 12. The Edge of Wanting. The next morning, Callum went to the training grounds early, needing to clear his mind before his emotions ruined him completely. The crisp morning air did little to soothe his nerves, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way Silas had looked at him last night. It was infuriating. If Silas had wanted to keep him, he should have fought for him long ago. Now it was too late for stolen glances and unspoken emotions. But when Callum turned, he found Silas standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him. His breath caught, his fingers curling into fists as he forced himself to stay still. Silas hesitated, then walked forward, his movements slow, cautious, like Callum was a wolf that might bolt if he moved too fast. "You're avoiding me," Silas finally said, voice quieter than usual. Callum let out a humorless laugh. "You say that like I owe you my time." He picked up a training staff, turning it over in his hands to avoid looking at him. It was easier to pretend he wasn't affected when he didn't meet Silas's gaze. Silas exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "You don't owe me anything," he admitted. "But I'm here, Callum. And I'm not leaving until you hear me out." The stubborn determination in his voice made something in Callum's chest tighten. This wasn't the same alpha who had spent years keeping him at arm's length. This was someone else, someone willing to fight. But was it too late? Callum let out a slow breath before turning to face him fully, meeting those familiar dark eyes. "Then say what you need to say," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Silas stepped closer, the air between them charged with something raw and fragile. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Silas whispered, "I should have chosen you. I should have fought for you." His voice cracked at the end, and Callum felt his carefully built walls start to tremble. He wanted to hold onto his anger, to throw every painful memory back in Silas's face, but then Silas did something unexpected. He reached for him, fingertips grazing Callum's wrist, a touch so light it sent a shiver down his spine. And suddenly, Callum wasn't sure if he was strong enough to walk away. Chapter 13. Cracks in the Ice. Callum should have walked away. He should have ignored the way Silas's fingers brushed against his wrist, should have pretended that his heart wasn't pounding hard enough to shake his ribs. But he didn't. He stood there, caught in the pull of something he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. His anger and resentment clashed violently with the desperate, aching part of him that had spent years waiting for this moment. "You don't get to say that now," Callum murmured, his voice sharp even as it wavered. "Not after everything." Silas flinched, but he didn't pull away. "I know," he admitted. "But I'm saying it anyway." For years, Silas had been the one in control, the untouchable alpha, the future leader who never let his emotions dictate his actions. But now he looked just as lost as Callum felt. "I tried to let you go," Silas whispered, his fingers curling slightly, as if resisting the urge to hold on tighter. "I told myself it was for the best, that it was the right thing to do. But the truth is, I was scared." Callum's breath hitched. Scared. The word cut through him like a blade. "Of what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Silas swallowed hard, his gaze locking onto Callum's. "Of wanting you more than I was allowed to." The weight of those words settled between them, thick with the things they had never said. Callum wanted to hate him for it. He wanted to shove Silas away, tell him that fear was a pathetic excuse for breaking someone's heart. But when he looked at Silas, really looked, he didn't just see the alpha who had hurt him. He saw the boy he had grown up with, the one who had always been just out of reach, the one he had loved even when it made him feel like a fool. And worse, he still wanted him. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Callum admitted, stepping back. The space between them felt unbearable. "I don't know if I want to." Silas nodded, something almost resigned in his expression. "Then let me prove to you that I'm not the same person I was back then," he said. "Give me a chance to fix this." Callum scoffed. "And if I don't?" Silas's lips quirked into the smallest, saddest smile. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it." The raw honesty in his voice did something terrible to Callum's resolve. He wasn't sure if Silas deserved another chance, but he also wasn't sure he could stand the thought of never knowing what they could have been. And that was the most terrifying part of all. Chapter 14. Close enough to break. The days that followed were a delicate game of push and pull, with Callum refusing to give Silas an easy way back into his life, and Silas refusing to give up. Every time Callum turned around, Silas was there, not overbearing, not demanding, just present. When Callum trained, Silas trained beside him. When Callum ate, Silas sat across from him. And when Callum tried to pretend that his heart wasn't cracking open every time their eyes met, Silas made damn sure he saw him anyway. It was infuriating. It was exhausting. It was working. One evening, after a particularly tense training session, Callum was wiping sweat from his brow when he felt a presence behind him. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. "You should stop following me," he muttered, but there was less bite in his words now, more exhaustion. Silas huffed a quiet laugh. "And miss out on your charming company? Never." The teasing lilt in his voice made Callum's lips twitch, but he smothered the almost smile before it could betray him. "What do you want, Silas?" The air between them was heavy with something unnamed, something dangerous. Silas hesitated for the briefest moment, then stepped closer, close enough that Callum could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I want you to stop looking at me like I'm a mistake you regret," he said, his voice raw. Callum froze. That wasn't fair. He clenched his fists, heart hammering against his ribs. "And I want you to stop acting like I owe you anything," he shot back. Silas's gaze darkened, and in a heartbeat, he closed the last bit of space between them. "You don't," he murmured. "But I'll keep showing up anyway." And before Callum could react, Silas reached up, gentle, tentative, and tucked a stray strand of hair behind his ear. The touch sent a shiver down Callum's spine, and for a split second, he forgot how to breathe. Silas had never touched him like this before, not with the weight of emotions behind it, not like Callum was something fragile and precious. It was too much. It wasn't enough. Callum turned sharply, stepping away before he did something reckless. "I need space," he said, his voice too unsteady for his liking. Silas didn't stop him this time. He just nodded, but there was something unspoken and dangerously close to hope in his gaze. Callum hated that it made his chest ache. Chapter 15. The First Step. Callum spent the next day trying to convince himself that the way his skin still tingled from Silas's touch meant nothing. He failed miserably. The problem wasn't just that Silas was being persistent. The problem was that Callum wanted him to be. He wanted to push Silas away, to make him feel the same kind of longing and frustration that had burned in Callum's chest for years. But the truth was, he had never been good at pretending. He had never been able to look at Silas and not want more. That evening, when Callum found himself walking toward the training grounds again, he wasn't surprised to see Silas already there. The alpha was sitting on the wooden bench, looking up at the night sky like he was waiting for something, or someone. Callum hesitated, then let out a slow breath before stepping closer. "You said you wanted a chance to prove yourself," he said, crossing his arms. "So prove it." Silas's head snapped toward him, his eyes widening slightly before something determined and intense settled in his gaze. "Tell me what you need from me," he said, standing. "And I'll do it." Callum hated how easily those words made his stomach flip. "I need you to stop talking in circles," he said. "If you want me, then say it. No more riddles. No more mixed signals." He wasn't expecting Silas to react so quickly, but before he could blink, Silas had closed the distance between them. "I want you," Silas said, voice low and rough with sincerity. "I've always wanted you. And I'm done pretending otherwise." The confession hit Callum like a strike to the chest. He swallowed hard, his heartbeat thundering. For the first time in years, there were no more walls between them. No more excuses. No more running. Silas wanted him. And the worst part? Callum had never stopped wanting him either. But wanting wasn't enough. Not yet. Callum exhaled slowly, forcing himself to hold Silas's gaze. "Then prove it," he whispered. And just like that, the game changed. Chapter 16. A Line Crossed. Silas had waited years for this moment. Too long, really. But standing here, with Callum's challenge hanging between them like a fragile thread, he realized this wasn't about what he wanted anymore. It was about what Callum needed. He had spent too much time making mistakes, too much time letting fear dictate his choices. Not anymore. Slowly, carefully, Silas reached out and curled his fingers around Callum's wrist. A simple touch, yet it sent a shockwave through both of them. "Then let me," he said, voice steady. "Let me prove it to you." Callum didn't move, didn't speak, just stared, his sharp eyes searching Silas's face for something, anything that would tell him this wasn't just another lie. The weight of his doubt settled between them, thick as fog. "I don't trust you," Callum admitted, and it should have stung. It did. But Silas nodded. "Then I'll earn it." The promise lingered in the air, and for a brief, dangerous moment, it almost felt like Callum wanted to believe him. Then, as if snapping back to reality, Callum pulled his hand away. "We'll see," he muttered. But Silas caught the hesitation in his voice, and that was enough. The following days blurred together in an unspoken dance between them. Not quite enemies, not quite lovers, caught in the delicate limbo of something unfinished. Silas kept his word, never pushing too hard, never stepping too close unless Callum allowed it. And Callum? He started watching Silas the way he used to, with that same quiet intensity that made Silas's chest feel too tight, too full, too hopeful. Every stolen glance, every lingering touch that neither of them acknowledged, it was driving Silas insane. But it was progress. Then, one evening, the line between them shattered. It started as a simple sparring match, just them, alone in the training ring. Callum moved fast, faster than Silas expected, and before he could react, Callum had him pinned. For a long, breathless second, neither of them moved. Callum was too close, his breath warm against Silas's skin, his hands pressed against Silas's chest. And Silas? He had never wanted anything more than to close the last bit of space between them. The moment stretched, tension crackling like a live wire. Then, Callum did something unexpected. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, Silas moved. Chapter 17. The First Kiss. It wasn't planned. It wasn't careful. 1 second, Silas was frozen beneath Callum's weight, and the next, he was kissing him. The moment their lips met, it was like something inside them both snapped. Callum let out a sharp breath, his fingers clenching against Silas's chest, as if debating whether to push him away or pull him closer. For a split second, Silas thought he had made a mistake. But then Callum kissed him back, soft at first, hesitant, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to want this. Then, all at once, the hesitation disappeared. Callum fisted the front of Silas's shirt and yanked him closer, deepening the kiss with a heat that stole the breath from Silas's lungs. It was messy, desperate, 5 years of unresolved tension crashing down on them all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Callum stared at Silas, something unreadable in his eyes, something fragile and unspoken. Then, as quickly as it had happened, he stepped back, shaking his head. He cut himself off, swallowing thickly. That shouldn't have happened. Silas felt the loss like a physical blow. "Why not?" he asked, voice rough. Callum didn't answer. He just turned and walked away. Silas stood there, watching him go, heart pounding, lips still tingling from the kiss. He should have expected this. He should have known Callum would run. But that kiss, that was real. And for the first time in years, Silas knew, Callum wanted him just as much as he wanted Callum. Now, he just had to convince him to stop running. Chapter 18. Running in Circles. The next morning, Callum avoided him. It was predictable, really, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. Every time Silas entered a room, Callum found a reason to leave. Every time Silas tried to catch his eye, Callum looked anywhere else. It was infuriating. But Silas wasn't giving up. By the third day, he'd had enough. He found Callum by the river, sitting on the edge of the bank, staring at the water like it held all the answers to his problems. Silas didn't hesitate. He walked right up to him and sat down beside him, ignoring the way Callum tensed at his presence. "You're avoiding me," Silas said plainly. Callum let out a humorless laugh. "You're just now noticing?" Silas sighed, running a hand through his hair. So, what? You kiss me like that, then decide it meant nothing. Callum flinched, but he covered it quickly, masking his emotions behind that carefully controlled expression. It's not that simple, he muttered. Silas let out a sharp breath. It is, though, he countered. You can pretend all you want, but that kiss? That wasn't one-sided, Callum. You felt it just as much as I did. Callum looked away, jaw tightening. That's the problem. Silas stilled. What do you mean? He asked, voice softer now. Callum exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Then, finally, he turned to look at Silas. I don't know how to want you without hating you at the same time, he admitted. And just like that, Silas understood. Chapter 19. More Than Regret. Silas didn't expect honesty. Not this soon. Not when Callum had spent years burying his emotions beneath layers of anger and avoidance. But here it was. And Silas didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. I get it, Silas said after a long pause. But hating me doesn't change the fact that you still want this. Callum laughed, but there was no humor in it. And what if I do? He challenged. Wanting something doesn't mean it's good for you. Silas should have let it go. He should have accepted that Callum wasn't ready. But he wasn't that selfless. Instead, he leaned in, just enough to make Callum's breath hitch. Maybe not, Silas murmured. But we both know neither of us is walking away from this. Callum's lips parted slightly, his pupils blown wide, and for a second, Silas thought he might actually close the distance again. But then, Callum pushed himself up, shaking his head. This is a mistake, he said. I can't do this. Silas didn't stop him this time. He just sat there, watching as Callum walked away, again. But he didn't feel defeated. Not this time. Because Callum could lie to himself all he wanted, but the truth was already there. He wanted Silas. And Silas wasn't letting go. Chapter 20. Fragile Bridges. Silas could feel the weight of the silence between them like a physical force, pressing down on his chest. It was the kind of silence that begged for words, begged for answers, yet neither of them were ready to speak the truth. Not yet. Not when everything felt so uncertain. They were walking a tightrope, every step careful, every movement calculated, yet neither of them seemed to be able to let go. Callum had never been good at showing vulnerability. Silas had always known that, but it didn't make it any easier. The day after their last confrontation, Silas couldn't focus. His thoughts were consumed with Callum's words, the ones he'd almost whispered when he thought Silas wasn't listening. I can't do this, Callum had said, but Silas knew the words weren't as final as they seemed. He didn't need Callum's rejection to tell him what was going on in his heart. The war inside Callum was becoming more and more visible, and Silas was the battlefield. Later that evening, they found themselves alone, again. Callum's back was turned to Silas, his posture rigid, but the way he held himself still, there was a trembling vulnerability in that stillness. You're still avoiding me, Silas said, breaking the silence, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of frustration. Callum didn't turn around. It's easier this way, he muttered, his words carrying a weight that Silas didn't need to have explained. Silas stepped closer, heart pounding. No, it's not, he said softly, his hand brushing Callum's arm. The touch was tentative, but it felt like the first step toward something that had been a long time coming. Callum shivered at the contact but didn't pull away. His eyes closed for a brief moment, and Silas could see the struggle written across his face. You're not alone in this, Silas added, his voice low, intense. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. Callum finally turned to face him, his eyes burning with emotion, confusion, longing, and something else. He swallowed hard, lips parted, as if he wanted to say something, but the words never came. And then, almost as if the universe had made the decision for him, Callum moved. He closed the gap between them in a single stride, pulling Silas into a kiss that stole the breath from his lungs. This time, there was no hesitation. No barriers. Just a fierce need to finally give in. The kiss was everything. It was desperate, filled with pent-up longing, and yet, as Callum's hands gripped Silas's shirt, pulling him closer, It was also soft, gentle, like they were both finally learning how to love each other without fear. Chapter 21. What Comes After. The kiss had changed everything, and nothing at all. When Silas woke the next morning, he was alone. No surprise there. But the absence of Callum wasn't as much of a sting as he had expected. Maybe it was because he could still feel Callum's warmth on his skin, still taste the kiss lingering on his lips. And maybe, just maybe, Callum hadn't left because he didn't want to. Maybe he just couldn't stay. Silas found Callum at the edge of the woods, standing still, staring into the distance. The world around him seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in the space between decisions. Silas approached, his heart pounding in his chest as he moved closer. Callum. Silas's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of everything they hadn't said yet. Callum turned slowly, his face betraying nothing, yet his eyes, told Silas everything. There was fear there. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of loving someone so completely, only to lose them. "Why did you run?" Silas asked, the question that had been haunting him ever since their kiss. Callum opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes searching Silas's face for any sign that he was still wanted. Still needed. Without a word, Silas closed the distance between them, cupping Callum's face in his hands. The touch was soft, tender, and when their lips met again, it was slow, like they were both afraid of what would happen if they rushed this. When they pulled away, breathless and tangled, Callum finally spoke. "I'm scared." His voice was raw, his walls crumbling for the first time in years. And Silas knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about Callum's fear of losing himself in someone else, of letting go of the control he'd always had. But that fear, it wasn't as strong as the pull between them. Silas gently wiped a tear from Callum's cheek, his heart aching for the man who had spent so long holding back. "I'm not going anywhere, Callum," Silas said softly. "I won't leave you." And for the first time, Callum believed him. Chapter 22. One Step Closer. The days following that conversation were a blur of new beginnings and unspoken promises. Callum's walls, once so impenetrable, began to crack. Slowly, bit by bit, he started letting Silas in. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments where Callum would retreat, where his fear would make him pull away, but Silas was patient. He had waited this long. What was a little more time? They spent hours together, talking, laughing, even sharing stories about their pasts, things they had never spoken of before. And through it all, Silas could feel the tension between them shifting, becoming something stronger, deeper, something real. One evening, they sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. Callum's arm brushed against Silas's, and the contact, though small, sent a jolt through Silas. It was familiar, yet it felt brand new. The simple act of being close to each other, of sharing space, was enough for the first time in years. Then Callum leaned over, his breath warm against Silas's ear. "I'm still scared," he murmured. "But I want to try. I want to see where this goes." His words were the ones Silas had been waiting for. Silas smiled, his heart swelling with something soft and full of promise. "Then we'll take it one step at a time," he replied, pressing a kiss to Callum's temple. "Together." And for the first time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. Chapter 23. Breaking Point. But life wasn't always kind, and love, even the kind they were building, was never without its trials. A challenge came that neither of them had expected, a danger to their pack. Word came from the other side of the territory. Rival wolves were making their move, and their leader was no one to be trifled with. It was a threat to the entire pack, and Silas knew that meant they'd have to fight. The air was thick with tension the day they went into battle, and Silas found himself next to Callum once again, side by side. But this time, there was more at stake. Their bond had been tested, but now, it was going to be proven. They couldn't afford to lose each other, not now. As the clash began, Silas's heart raced, not just because of the danger, but because he could feel Callum's presence next to him, feel the way they were in sync, moving like they had always been meant to. Their bond was unbreakable. But the battle wasn't over yet, and they had only just begun to truly fight for each other, and for the life they were building together. Chapter 24. The Calm After the Storm. The battle had ended, but the victory felt hollow. The pack was safe, but the cost was high. Wounds had been inflicted on both sides, and the aftermath of it all hung heavily in the air. Yet amidst the chaos, Silas found that his heart was still whole, because Callum was by his side. There had been moments, in the heat of battle, when Silas had feared he would lose him forever. The thought had been unbearable. When they finally stood together after the dust had settled, Silas could see the weariness in Callum's eyes, the fatigue of battle, but also the weight of their unspoken emotions. Callum had always been someone who carried the world on his shoulders, never letting anyone in. But now, with their bond tested and strengthened by the fight, Silas could see the cracks in that armor. "Are you okay?" Silas asked softly, stepping closer to Callum, his hand brushing the Alpha's shoulder. It was a simple touch, but it conveyed everything Silas needed to say. Callum turned toward him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself truly soften. "I'm fine," he said quietly, his voice raw. "But you," he paused, eyes searching Silas's face, before continuing. "You mean everything to me, Silas. I didn't realize how much until today." The confession was simple, but it hit Silas like a tidal wave. He stepped forward, wrapping his arms around Callum, holding him close. For a moment, the world fell away. There was no war, no pack to protect. Just them, finally, after everything they'd been through. "I don't want to live in a world where you're not by my side," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Callum's arms tightened around him, and in that moment, Silas knew that everything they had fought for had been worth it. They didn't need to speak more. The silence between them was perfect, the kind that said everything they had left to say. Chapter 25. The Future They Choose. The sun rose the following morning, casting a soft glow over the landscape as the pack began to rebuild. It was a new beginning, not just for them as a pack, but for Silas and Callum as well. The battle may have been won, but now it was time for a different kind of fight, the fight to claim the future they wanted. Silas and Callum stood side by side, looking out over the horizon, their hands brushing lightly against each other. The weight of what they'd been through, what they'd survived, was still heavy, but the future felt infinitely more possible with each other. They had forged something strong in the fire of their shared experiences. "We made it through," Callum said softly, his voice filled with awe and a bit of disbelief. "Together." Silas smiled, looking up at him. "We always will," he replied, the certainty in his voice reflecting everything he felt in his heart. Their future wasn't a fairy tale, but it was theirs to build, one step at a time. They would face challenges, but they would face them together, just as they had from the start. No more fear. No more hiding. Just love. And with that, they walked into the future side by side, ready for whatever came next. Their bond, unbreakable.